Okay, so a couple more JPA annotations. Here is the temporal annotation that allows you to map to the SQL data types fairly easily. That can be a little sticky in terms of the different date types from Java to excuse me, from Java to SQL, so that can come in handy. Now, in terms of, this is the other thing that you'll be doing a lot, which is querying, okay? And as I said, if you use the methodology I was describing about doing the database first, a lot of this will be created for you, so you don't actually have to create your own queries unless they happen to look different from the ones that get created for you. You'll see this when you do the exercise, the CRUD exercise with the JSF front end. Excuse me, the queries come in two flavors, the non-native SQL ones, which is the dynamic, as I said, and the statically defined ones, which in this terminology are called named queries. Again, sort of like the prepared statements that you're used to. There are two basic kinds of syntax that you can use. JPQL, which is based off of HQL, which is the Hibernate query language that you might have seen before, and the Criteria API, which is much more Java style. And again, I'm not going to get into that, but you know, if you're interested, you can check it out. Native SQL, there's that third method that'll let you drop into native SQL. The named queries allow you to have named parameters. They also have keyword parameters, those would be the named parameters. They also have positional parameters, again, like the prepared statements. One other useful capability is this idea of what you could call pagination. In other words, how to, you could generate a query that could come back with a million rows easily. And there's nothing to stop that unless you're careful. However, generally speaking, that's not what you'd want. So there is an ability inside the methods to only it's two things that you need. One is you say, give me n things back and start at m. If you have those two things, then you can do the pagination. And you can control it completely by yourself. Now, in fact, some of the more advanced data table kind of tags, particularly even more so than the JSF, the H: data table, the ones in the prime faces actually give you a lot of nice capabilities for doing that, so you don't even have to get down to this level. What other things? You can either ask for a single result if you're only expecting one thing back, or usually you'll get multiple things back, or not even. It depends what you're doing, I guess. And then if you really need to get into the specifics of the underlying database, there are ways of actually tweaking those special things that Oracle has versus MySQL versus DB2. So JPQL, it's SQL, but not. It's an object-oriented version of the kind of SQL language that you're used to. It's actually it's more robust and flexible than standard SQL, and of course it's object-oriented too. Basically, what happens is the persistence engine, the JPA part of the server, parses the query string and transforms it into native SQL, which is what you would expect before executing it. JPQL uses this concept of path expressions to refer to fields. They don't directly refer to the columns of the table. That's why one of the things is it looks similar, but it's different. When you look at the examples, you'll see how it's, if you look at it quickly, you'd say, oh, that's SQL, but then you'll say, well, wait a second, that's not exactly the SQL syntax. Again, because it uses a slightly different way of describing its syntax. Another thing that, and this is, you sort of, kind of giving up some of the control, when you do a get result list, that's a very common thing to do, to return multiple results. the tool may be doing all kinds of joins and queries in order to satisfy the complex nature of the query that you just made. So you don't really necessarily have full control over it the way that you would if you're writing your own SQL. So, I mean, here's a case where if it does something wildly inefficient, then you might be forced into dropping into native SQL to get the right kinds of, that this join happens before that one, because otherwise it's, goes execution wild or something. But I mean, it's pretty good at doing it. So hopefully you won't need that. So these are the class methods again. Create query, that's the dynamic query. Create name query, that's the static one, like this prepared statement. And then, the third one is the native that allows you to drop into SQL. Here are the methods. Get result list means do the query and give me multiples back. Get single result, okay. Execute update, that's what actually does the, you create an update or delete, and it will actually do that, do the execution of that. Here is the start at the first one, and here is give me at max number back. Okay, this is what allows you to do any kind of pagination you want, as long as you keep track of where you are. This set parameter has to do with these positional parameters or name parameters. I'll show you. This is the hook into the database engine's hints that might help make it more efficient. And then there's this concept of a flush model that's a database thing, and you have access to it if you need it. So here's a single result. You use the entity manager, use the create query method, quotes, or however you want to create that string. So select C from customer where C.id equals that, okay? So you can see that it feels like SQL on the face of it, but it's not exactly. This one's actually closer than most. And what it does is, so that's the query, and then you're going to actually execute the single select query against that, okay? And you're going to ask for the single result to come back. See how you tag the methods on each other like that? This particular one returns a single entity. If there's no match, then it throws this exception, okay? Whoops. If more, I'm sorry about that. That's if more than one comes back, that also throws a non-unique exception back, okay? Which is why you're probably more inclined to use this one, because it's you get rid of one of the exceptions. Get result list will return a query and will return a list object with one or more, one or more. Zero would be a heck. I'm sorry. That's not me hitting that. That's the way that the animation is done. But basically, that's essentially what it does. It returns a list, and then you would go through the list and you can see it on your PDFs. I'm sorry. Now, the second, so that's create. This is create query, and it does it at runtime, and it passes in that string. So any of these would work with that. But of course, what that means is that the dynamic query gets compiled and checked every time it gets executed, which is why you start to look at using the named queries instead. So these are, it's very flexible, of course, because you can create it completely on the fly by building the string. However, it's going to be less efficient, just in general, because it has to essentially recompile the query every single time it hits it. So that's why we use named queries. So named parameters are one way of taking a standard query and giving it arguments. Okay. So in this case, oh heck, I'm very sorry. Man, I'm sorry. Let me stop there, because I really want to show you that. Sorry, it's the animation. It's the PowerPoint animation that's doing that to me. So here's the multiple results. This one, I'm sorry, can you see at the bottom there? So you create the query, and then you do a get result list, and it's going to return the list. And then in this case down here, I don't know if you can see, whoops, if you can see that, let's see, where is it? No, where did I go? Oh, I'm sorry, here. If you can see this down here, you have to cast it properly in order to get the right type back, okay? So, let's see. So, this is the dynamic query, name parameters. Okay, so I'll go back as soon as I get beyond these. I think there are just a few of them like this. So, in this particular case, so here you write this method. It's called find with name, takes a string. It's going to return this thing. This is the create query. And what you see here is using this notation, it uses the colon here, and this is effectively an argument. Okay? And what it does is it's in this case, it's relating this thing, this argument that you're passing in with this parameter, and it does it via using set parameter. Okay? So cust name is that cust name was that name, and then it actually executes the get result. Okay? Let's see. Positional parameters, similar idea, except it uses a syntax that's based upon where in the string you're doing the substitution. Okay, so if it's question mark 1, that would be the first parameter. And question mark 2 is the second. Question mark 3, etc., like that. And then set parameter here, instead of taking the name like cust name, it uses the position. Okay, instead, but the same idea. Okay, so either of those work quite well. So the idea. Let me see if it does this to me again. Oops. Sorry. If you want to do this, one of the things that you do is create what are called named queries. So this is essentially how you create these static looking queries that you can then use the parameters with. You can, with this annotation, you have a name and then you've got the query string. Okay? So the named query, and again, what you'll find when you do your assignment is that NetBeans will actually create these named queries for you, okay, by default. But you can always make more of your own if you want. And so this one is called Find All Customers. And it is going to do a select C from customer, which is essentially select all the customers from the customer table. And you're going to call it, you're going to ask the entity manager to call create named query against find all customers, and that once you do the get result list on that, that should return all of the matching customers. So what you would then be able to do is simply use the named query from then on, and it's much more efficient. So what you'll see is, in your case, when it creates them all, there'll be essentially kind of like an array of, or a list of named queries. And that's what this notation does. With the named queries, which contain a list of named query objects, essentially. Okay, and there'll be a whole bunch of them that it will attempt to create for you based upon the fields that your entity contains. Okay, let's see if I can get back into the groove here. So here's another useful feature of this, is this ability to do pagination of your results. And simple, you would do, this happens to be a dynamic query, but the point is that before you actually execute the query, you're just creating it up here. Before you execute it, you're going to say, give me max records back, okay? Which in this case happens to be 10. Select query, set the first result, start position, which the first time you come in here is it counts from 0. So from there, And so every time that you did this, you could increment the set first result. So it'll say, give me the first 10, then the second 10, and the third 10. That's the basic idea here. Okay? So you could write something like this and get that effect very simply. And then, of course, the last thing is if nothing else works, obviously you want it to do as much work for you. If none of those works quite right, or you can't get exactly what you want, or it's performing badly, you might have to do this, which was, excuse me, sorry. I didn't notice that when I was writing it the other day. Oops. In this case, this would be, now this here, if you look at this closely, this actually is SQL. Okay, that's the big difference. Okay, and you could use that all the time if you wanted to. It's just you're doing more work than you probably need. But if you need to do something special, then of course you actually can get to that level. Okay. There is, just as the last thing, the flush mode has to do with releasing these objects. You have to be careful when you're doing this in general, because you could wind up building up an awful lot of stuff. Because when you do get query results and you're not careful, just imagine what can happen. If you, you're expecting 10 things to come back and you get 500,000 back, obviously getting rid of them is important. Generally speaking, you don't have to worry about this, but there are times when you might have to take a hand in this. So auto is the default, so you don't really normally have to worry about it. So the statement language itself includes all of the standard SQL-ish type things. There's a select, an update, which is actually the insert and update, I guess, delete, and all the standard kinds of clauses, from, where, group by, having, order by. So pretty much everything that you would need, I think, is probably there for you in this language. And conditional expressions too. So just to summarize all this, the mapping is tricky, but the tools can help you. JPA, Hibernate, NetBeans. Underlying it all, though, is Jdbc, so sometimes you need to get underneath there. So JPA makes it much easier to do OR mapping and data management, and the tools can do a lot for you, so you don't have to write a lot of it. And you can have it go either direction. You can have it created the DB tables and the relationships from your code, or vice versa. That's up to you. There's your SQL-like language, criteria API. I would say take a look at it if the JPQL for some reason doesn't suit you. And then you can also, of course, write any native SQL. And one thing which I haven't really pointed out very much, though I'll mention it as soon as I show you your that project that you were working on, I'll point it out. The idea of database connection pooling is very important in any kind of web application, because they're all going to need to connect to databases of some kind. I don't care what language you write it in or what tools you use. However, in general, when you're linking to databases, the slowest thing, the most execute-intensive thing, is usually making the connection to the database. Okay? So what you don't ever want to do is, for your application, that has any kind of volume going through it, is to create a connection. Matter of fact, do you remember the Jdbc example I showed you? Where I showed you, you get a connection object, you open the connection, you do your thing, you retrieve the values, you close the connection, let it, okay. That's not what you want to do. And literally that's the whole process that one normally goes through. But in fact, that first step where you get the connection, okay, you open the connection to the database, directly to the database, that from a performance point of view is a bad idea, because that step there is not something you would want to do on every HTTP request, because that's by far the slowest thing in your application, I'm sure. So what do you do? Well, the idea, and this is usually called, connection pooling, database connection pooling. I mean, and this idea is, it's not only for database connections, it's for any kind of scarce resource that is shared. But in this case, this would be for database connections. And the idea is, why don't I, instead of making a connection for every single request that I get and then opening it and dropping it, is why don't I get a bunch of them right up front before I start doing anything else, and manage it as a pool, okay? So, because most of the time they're not going to be used, right? Because they're going to be doing other things, and then somebody's going to request something from the database. So at that point, let's say I collect 100 of them, and I open 100 connections. This is the main user opening a connection to their database and keeping 100 of them around. And then instead of the code going to open a new connection to the database, it comes to me and asks me for one of the ones I already have. Okay? And then it's already open. So the worst part is already done. I then, as the pool manager, give them the code. I give the code the connection, and I say, okay, do your stuff. And when you're finished with it, give it back to me. Release it. And then it goes back into the pool. Okay? That, very simple, right? That is a tremendous win for, I don't care if you're doing your Java, you're doing Python, you're doing Ruby on Rails, you're doing PHP, whatever, because everybody has to do this. When it comes down to supporting lots and lots of database accesses like this, everybody's got to do something like this. So in our case, I'll show you in Glassfish how that happens to work. In Tomcat, it's slightly different, but the principle is the same. So, okay, let's see, where are we? 6. So, here is our application. Since I'm talking about that, let me jump to that right away. But you should recognize this guy. This is your dreaded, simple, maybe not so simple EE6 app. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the other aspects of it. But since I'm talking about that, let me point out where that's going on. Okay, so in the let me see, is it defined? Okay, so here's the persistence XML. So a couple of points. This is actually the one I showed you before. So here, this is the persistence unit. When you when you create the persistence context, it has to know what am I connecting to? What's managing this? So this is where that's defined ultimately. The data source is this thing called Jdbc/sample. So we got to understand where that thing is coming from, what that's referring to. The way it works, because this happens to be Glassfish, the way that it works is Glassfish has a mapping. It has a database connection pooling capability built right into it. Okay, and then basically what you do, you have to define two things. You define the pool, how big it is, etc., and then what is it connecting to. Okay, and then it will manage everything I just described. You don't have to do. It'll do for you. Okay, so where does this Jdbc sample thing come from? Well, actually, all right, now I'll show you, I've already opened it, but I'll show you what you would normally do to get at it. So you recognize where I am, right? The Glassfish server, I click right on it. You probably haven't done this very much, but there are things that you can do. Normally it starts automatically when you say run, okay? But the thing that you probably haven't done is this, view the domain admin console. So if you click on that, it actually opens this thing, okay, in your browser. And you can see there's actually a lot of stuff that you can configure and control in this. But the one that I'm interested in right now is this one, this Jdbc one. Okay? So if I open this, then the concept is that I'm going to create a pool of connections, and then I'm going to define the particular Jdbc string that I'm going to then use to refer to that thing. Okay? So you open this guy up, And now it happens to exist already, but you could, and it will be created for you, I guess, in your example. I don't, oh, no, in that example you have to do it by hand, yes. But at least you've seen this first, if you haven't been there yet. But this is what you would do. You would go and create it, but assuming you did that first step, okay? This happens to be the sample that we were talking about with the messages, that it lives in here. So assuming we went through that step to create it, this is what you would see. So over here, this is now we're getting close to the how it's connecting to the database. So we're going to give it a name. In this case, they usually call them something pool to make it obvious. Oops. It's a SQL data source. That's a package that contains all that JDBC stuff. This particular one, in your case, this will look different. It will be the MySQL version of this. But the one that from your message app is the JavaDB equivalent of that. That's why it looks a little different here. Let's see what else. Here's the pool definition. So now, of course, since you were the only one using your application, this didn't really make much difference. But let's say you had 1,000 users all pounding on it simultaneously. Each time they updated the message, they would have had to make a trip to the database. So what this does, if you were supporting those 1,000 simultaneous users, it would look at let's say, there's a maximum pool size which says I'm going to create a maximum of 32 connections. And those get opened before the application starts, before anybody starts to use it. And then of those, I'm going to start with 8. So that's kind of a max. So you could make it much higher. So we'll start with 8 and then let it grow up to 32 as they're needed. Because what's going to happen is they're going to get used and then released and used and released. So it really depends upon how your application is written and how many users you have. And then there are a couple of other things that you have here. For example, the idle timeout, max wait time. If somebody walks away, they have a connection open, and they leave their browser while they're sitting there, and the app is holding on to that connection because it can't release it until they finish doing what they're doing. This is 300 seconds, which is how many minutes? 5 minutes. 5 minutes. If it detects no activity in 5 minutes, it'll say, I'm sorry, and it'll give the connection back to the pool. So you get that idea, okay? And then that's when that's idle, and then the max wait timeout is another flavor of that. But that's the idea, okay? So you can tweak these numbers to support much, much larger numbers of users. So the other thing here, so this is that's the pool definition, and now to get back to the thing that you were relating to, you saw JDBC/sample. That's the only thing that you really saw that was referencing the database. So that is now here. So basically what you usually do is create the pool and then create the resource. And so now this is where the connection is going to occur. Let me see. I'm sorry, I skipped over something. In here, there's more to this here. Additional properties. Because you might say, you still didn't tell me where the host is. You didn't tell me what the username is. You didn't tell me what the password was. You still need all that to connect to the database, right? That's here, under additional properties. We're back in the pool again, okay? So you see the username, database name, server name, port number, URL. That's where and the password. That's where all of the guts of connecting to the database is done. Okay, and then comes the last part, which is to come up with the JDBC string that refers to all that stuff. And so this is what in your code is actually what you see being referred to. So that's basically the concept of how it works in a Glassfish environment. And this would be similar in any of the servers. They may, have a different interface, but the concepts are there. Okay. Okay. So let me go back and just tidy up a few things that you might be interested in or want to ask about. So we looked at, this is the, you see that, now you see how it relates back to this thing here, okay? This thing then relates to the persistence unit. The persistence unit is referred to in, well, where is our entity? Do you remember where they, where it lives in this guy? It lives under message. This is your entity definition, which hopefully will make a little more sense now. So, in this, there's very little in this. Again, this is convention over configuration. It's basically just a class, all right? It's serializable. That's a little special. But the only thing that's really here is, the only thing that's really here is the annotation for entity and what is the primary key. And then, again, this is how do you make it unique? And that's it. And other than that, it's just a Java class, okay? So really, you only had to add like 3 lines, and all of a sudden you made it, hooked it into the database. Now, so let me put that away. Now, as I said, typically, well, let's go back just to see how this relates back to our JSF front end. So the first page, the index page, simply has the space for the message and then a button. So where is it getting that the information, or where is it, in this case, where is it going to put the information? Because that's really what you're talking about. So it's using this this presentation package, my presentation. That's the view part of your MVC app. So if we look there at message view, and I'm sorry, this is where the confusing part comes in. Message view.message.message. Because let's look at what message view is. So message view, it's a well, this is a JSF managed bean. I asked you to change it into a CDI bean, but other than that, it's the same. And the message, I'll get back to the EJB in a second. The message that it's referring to is message here, okay? So unfortunately, they kind of overload the term message, so it gets a little confusing. But this would be the interface to the, from the JSF page into the entity, okay? Now, what is going on here? This here is, remember I mentioned this idea of a session facade, is actually hides the details. It's a general term. It hides the details of whatever's behind it and presents a unified interface. Okay, I'll come back to that again when I talk about EJBs. But that's in essence, that's what it is. In this case, what they're trying to hide is the details of what's inside the entity. You know, if we go back and look, there wasn't much detail there, but you don't want to expose any of that really to any of the other parts of the business logic or application, because at some point in the future you may swap out how that's done, and you don't want to have to rewrite your whole app to do that. So if you put this facade, and in English a facade means something that stands in front of something else, usually hiding something. If you write to that specification, then you can do whatever the heck you want, kind of like the Wizard of Oz, you know, behind the curtain. You don't know what the heck is going on back there, and you don't care, because all you see is and interact with is this thing in the front. So here, and this is where I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, but this EJB is essentially another injection mechanism. And what you're injecting here is you say, where the heck I'm using this thing here, like here, down at the bottom. I'm using this thing called message facade. Normally speaking, how do you get an object? You have to do new something, right? Okay, and then you give it, if it's a constructor, maybe it takes, you notice you're not doing any of that. That is the decoupling that I'm talking about when you're doing design. That's one of the things, that's really what dependency injection is all about, is to make those dependencies much looser. Because the tighter you make them, the harder it is to change anything or fix anything or to have multiple people working on the same thing at the same time. If you make it a very loose coupling, like this whole injection mechanism. It simply says, I need one of these things, okay? And then the system, I'm assuming somebody somewhere in, I don't care, Mumbai or, somebody wrote it, and, I need to use it, and he called it that, and I know how to use it, but I don't know where to get it. Okay, so that's what this whole injection business is about, is it allows you not to have to worry about that. So the EJB here, the @EJB, is an annotation which is doing an injection of a session bean, or yes, exactly, a session bean of some sort. So somewhere under this message facade class here is actually, we now know, is a session bean, okay? By definition, otherwise this wouldn't work, okay? So basically, what we can then do is we say, okay, well, let's follow that through. Let's look at message facade. Obviously, we're using it. And voila, see, stateless. It's a stateless session bean, which I'll get into in more detail next time. I actually posted, by the way, this is another, you could do me a favor. I posted the EJB discussion that you've been reading about it, but I wanted to make sure I covered a bunch of things that you were comfortable with the concepts. I posted it already under the lectures, so you can please take a look at it before next time so we can go through it faster. But a stateless session bean, as you know from your readings, is an object that's provided by the container, and it has certain attributes. Basically, stateless means that you can have many, many, many of them. The container can contain hundreds, thousands, whatever it decides, and that's a configuration also. And they are essentially passed out as needed. Okay, so you get one, and you do something and let it go. You get one, you ask for one, get it, let it go. Okay, so it maintains, hence the name, it maintains no state. Okay, so for something like this, it's perfect because I simply want to get it. In this case, its only purpose is to grab me the entity manager. Okay, so I'm shielding myself even from that. And then, and that's it. And then as soon as it gives me that, it can go away. Somebody else can use it. I don't care. That's up to the container to figure out. Okay. So now one other point I'll make, as long as we're looking at this, is the message facade is actually, well, in this case, it actually inherits it. But this concept of an abstract class is also something that you'll see used a lot in doing this kind of facade type thing. Because oftentimes what you do, you know what an abstract class is, right? Normally speaking, it doesn't, well, this one actually implements more than usual, but it normally defines the interface for something, okay? Or it's the flavor of that. And in this case, it's a little different because it's actually doing inheritance and not implementation. But it's the same basic concept as an interface and implement, abstract, and inherit. A different way of getting at the same idea. In other words, you have an abstract kind of thing, and then you will create a special version. Oftentimes you might have a special version that is, does thing in one language, and then you're doing basically the same thing, but then it's got a few special things, and so you inherit or you implement it from the interface, and you twiddle with it, and it does something slightly different. So the point is you're trying to reuse as much as possible, and that's what we're doing here. So most of the work that is in the facade is actually appearing here. There was very little in the message facade thing itself, because all of the interface to the entity was actually hidden in here. Okay, so here's the get entity manager. So here's create an entity. That would be equivalent of create a new instance and then persist it. Well, actually, you see it; it's doing it. Okay, and so instead of the developer having to know about persist and merge and that sort of stuff, you give them a normal language for this particular problem. Okay, you could, I mean, even more so, you could, since we're talking about Well, actually, this is the abstract one, so you don't even know about messages at this point. So this is even a little bit more abstract. So instead of knowing about persists and entity managers, you simply say create one. Instead of merge, you say edit, which is really more what merge is doing. It's taking the changes and making them available to be updated. Remove, well, that's the same. Find, well, in this case, it's the same terminology, but instead of you having to know about the entity manager and the syntax for the find method, you simply say, this is what I'm looking for, find it, okay? So you see what I'm saying is that it provides this other kind of simpler interface for you. So what you're going to find is that this is a very common thing to do. Here, by the way, is this particular example doesn't use JPQL. It's actually using the criteria API. Okay, so if you look at this, see this, here's the criteria builder is what's used to actually make a query. And so the syntax looks a little different. It's CQ.select and then CQ from this entity class. So you see it's actually much more Java-ish in the syntax. I mean, you can do all the same stuff, but if you come from an SQL background, this may look kind of odd. But both work perfectly well, and if you like this better, God bless you. But you see, you can do all of the same sort of stuff. But see here, the whole point is like here, find range. So you see this is actually quite complex how this does this. To find this, this is actually the pagination command. It says find range from, and it'll ask for, give me the 10, next 10, whatever. But you don't want them to have to know anything about how this actually works, because this is all entity related stuff. So the facade, you see, that's the whole point. Okay? So that's why you'll see this whole concept come up again and again. And you'll see it, this happens to be JPA, a facade for JPA, but you'll see it in other places. You'll see it as a facade for other EJBs, session beans of other kinds. Anything where you want to abstract out and provide a nice consistent interface so they don't have to know what's going on underneath the covers. Okay? Let's see, what else did I want to show you? So there's the facade stuff, the message stuff, the message view. I think, let's see, so this is where you actually create the messages, and this is using the facade. This is actually almost one level beyond that, because it's actually like get number of messages is actually do a message facade find all size, okay? So it's much nicer to give your coder to say get number of messages than having to know anything about the entity or the find all command, or does it have a size method, and all that stuff. Likewise with post message. So if you follow this through, if you say post message, that's actually what it says on the JSF page. And it does a message facade create message, which if you look in message facade is actually doing a query, an entity JPA query underneath. So again, you see how you're hiding all of that, and that's an important development concept, architectural concept. I don't think there was anything else I wanted to particularly. Were there any other questions you had about basically how this worked? I think you probably are disgusted and tired of this by now.
It's really hard to go back from managed bean to CDI. Once you use management up to a certain stage and then go convert it into a CDI bean, it gives a lot of problems regarding different things. And
well, no, okay, what do you mean? It shouldn't.
First of all, I don't know if it was part of the Glassfish server or something, but it did not allow the request scope or the session scope variable to be converted from the managed bean context.
That's because you had the wrong, I'm sure you had the wrong package.
It says that it did not have the package, first of all, so I was like, had to like
Sure.
see.
I never had to import anything.
Yeah.
All I did is, the major thing that will bite you is what bit Michael originally, is that the managed bean, the JSF managed bean, okay, concept. Managed bean is a general concept,
Right.
But the JSF style, @sign managed bean requires, and for example, it's the same annotation, @sign request scoped. If you're using the manage bean style, the JSF one, the package for request scoped is different.
Yep.
Okay, and if you shift over to named,
Yeah, I did that package.
then you have to do both packages.
Yeah, I did the change for the import for both the packages, like change the import for both of them, not just the
Okay.
name context, but
Then it should work. It is,
gave an error constantly about that package does not exist, the one which I imported. And then when I actually
does
get
that
to
sound
solve
familiar?
this-
Actually, when we try to inject the bean, it gives unsatisfied.
Yeah, that's one of the things.
Exists for type of message, type message.
I tried with it, I tried it doesn't work for me.
Yeah, it simply doesn't hit that message facade, message view, EJB at all, like whatever we do.
Okay, let me see this. Hang on for a second. I don't know. I was playing around with. I essentially did a lot of the assignment that you did before you did it. But
I just last 2 days I just did this troubleshooting which I couldn't do.
and one of the things, let's see, what did I do? Where is this? No? I thought I changed that. Or maybe it's this one. User info. Yeah, user info here. Which is the same thing, I guess. Well, here, let me try it. Okay, so you're saying if I asked you to change this managed bean into a CDI named bean,
Yeah.
and you said it wouldn't work.
It did, and then
Yeah.
it asked us to change the import, which I did, and then
Well, here, let me try. If I do it, for example, okay, so let me save it just in case. Okay, so if I change this to, okay, I can get rid of, you can say value equals, but I can just get rid of that altogether. Just say that. Oops. No, it's got to be capital. Name. Okay, so now it's going to complain and say that's not there. All right.
Right.
So what I'll do is, okay, I say add import for that.
right.
Now, the problem is if I tried to go ahead now, it would complain.
Yeah, because of the request scope being in
It's the wrong one.
right.
Okay, that's not obvious.
Yep.
Because it looks identical.
Yeah.
So that's where you have to, see, it just changed it for me. Okay? So now, that's it. Ostensibly, that's,
Yeah, when I did this transition thing, I mean changing it.
let me see. No? It works for me.
Yeah, the import that happened, the import that happened for the request scope up there, that gives an error that this import does not exist. So when
Are
I
you
tried to fix it, it was
sure?
a problem about the Glassfish server, so I
Yes.
reinstalled it.
That's what it
Then
sounds
the
like.
problem was solved.
Oh, okay, so you didn't, so you had a
Yeah,
messed
but
up configuration.
After that, whatever I did, whatever I tried to troubleshoot, that particular message bean did not get hit at all for the view messages and the form that sort of displays.
I don't know, it sounds like, this feels like you, Michael, that somehow the configuration was messed up.
Probably I
somewhat.
had some bad day with the configuration.
Yeah, and
Doesn't work.
has everybody seemed to have a decent setup now? Because let me, I'll tell you what, I know, we went through this with Mike here, it was painful. But the only suggestion that I can give you that should work
Yeah.
is if you're having trouble like that, delete everything. Not your projects. Delete, no, I'm serious. No, I'm not, but you have to be careful when I say this. You uninstall Glassfish, uninstall NetBeans, okay? And a couple of other things. Go to the directories where they got installed and make sure they're gone. And manually delete them. And also, there's one other place, and that is in the, what was it, Mike? The .NetBeans configuration. Also inside of your own directory. There's usually in Linux or in Mac OS, I guess it was called .NetBeans something. It's like a hidden directory. I forget what it is in Windows, but everybody's got it somewhere on your system, where you have your local changes that you make, like the plugins and all the rest of that. Get rid of that too, or more. and then reinstall everything from scratch.
Actually, the interesting thing is I finally gave up on the last day, and the day that you provided the extra day, and then I finally submitted it with the comments that this is the way it is and it's not working. The next day when I started with the next assignment, I thought, let's just first clean everything up.
Good, okay.
And then start the new one, because I
Okay.
don't have the same problem. So when I cleaned everything up, uninstalled everything, deleted all the directories files, and
Okay, okay.
installed NetBeans 8.2 and
Yeah.
Glassfish 4.1.
Yeah, yeah,
And then when I imported I created the project for the next
yeah.
assignment, that is for the database
Yeah.
assignment. It actually, when I created this managed bean from the database option,
Yeah, yeah.
it actually created the named bean itself at the starting point, which did not happen before.
That's because it's probably the newer version. There's things, yeah, because as I've said, managed bean, the JSF managed bean is being, it still works,
Yeah.
but it's being deprecated. So I think the newer version of NetBeans has moved to the CDI version.
Just being curious, I opened the old project which was there for my,
Yes.
and I saw whether that solves my problem.
And solve the problem.
It did not do it. It still did not run.
It still didn't work?
It did not. It actually runs. The pages run, but the
Yeah.
messages won't get displayed. The form won't get displayed and stuff. And it's just I do not know what to say about this.
Okay.
So I actually mentioned in the comments.